Aloha mai, kako. Are we live now? To open this space for the decolonizing cities, we're going to start with an oli to center our thoughts and our spirit. We're going to do eho mai 3 times, and if you know it, please join in from wherever you are. Eho mai kai ke mai luna mai e. O na mea huna no e au, o na mele e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, kai ke mai luna mai e. O na mea huna no e au, o na mele e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai e ho mai kai ke mai luna mai e. O na mea huna no e au, o na mele e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai e. Well, aloha mai kako. Greetings, everyone. O au o Tuti Baker, mai ka Ahupua'a o Kailua, o moku o ko'olau poko. He Hawaii au. Aloha, everybody. Greetings. I'm Tuti Baker, and I'm from the Ko'olau Poko district on the island of Oahu. I'm currently a guest on the land of the Latimush and Nooksack peoples in the town that settler colonials named Bellingham. And any conversation about decolonization has to address the impacts that colonialism has on our individual and collective relationship to land and the more than human, the rocks, the plants, the animals, clouds, rain, and the multitude of geological and meteorological existence of place. What is our relationship to the place where we are? What are our responsibilities as individuals and as diverse collectives? Pacific Islanders and let me change the slide. Pacific Islanders and Indigenous communities across the globe mediate these questions through protocols and ceremonies that reinforce relationships and responsibilities. The photos on the screen are examples of 2 such protocols. The first is a pofiri that Maori educator Dr. Linda Tuhivai Smith talks about in a public lecture she gave at celebrating the 15th anniversary of the publication of Decolonizing Methodologies. This pofiri, she tells us, was an opportunity for her iwi, her relatives, to shift the center. The occasion is welcoming Jacques Derrida to the marae. And because Derrida is a well-known European intellectual, she tells us, it's easy to think it's all about Derrida. But, and now I'm quoting her from the talk, in this particular ceremony, it's all about the space. And it's about moving people through space, through a series of protocols that then join people together. And she thought, when we're thinking about changing, how do you change a perspective? It's really trying to understand that space in which perspectives are created and shaped and formed, in which they interact. Another protocol prevalent in Kanaka Maoli gatherings are circles. The circle in this photo is an Aloha circle that begins the working day at Ho'ulu āina. Now, Ho'ulu āina is a healing place, a forest reserve in urban Honolulu that's run by a community health center in Kalihi. And this photo is of a community work day where a diverse group of people have come to work in the gardens and the forests of Ho'ulu āina. They begin by standing shoulder to shoulder, and like the pofiri, the energy of the group coalesces in the center. So what I want to ask us all to do today is join hands in a virtual circle. And start by centering yourself in place. What is your relationship to the place where you are? What are your individual and collective responsibilities to that place? And then focus your attention on the virtual space that we're sharing here in Zoomland and the insights and knowledge that today's speakers will share about decentering the impacts that colonialism has on our individual and collective relationship to land and the more than human in the urban environment. And with that, I pass the talking stick to Sean Connolly, who is going to expand on this from his perspective as artist and architect.
Can you hear me? Apologies. Thank you, Tuti, for starting us off in such a beautiful way. Aloha, I'm Sean Connolly. I'm an artist architect, zooming here from Kapahulu. I think to start, I would like to acknowledge definitely Miwa Tamanaha, who's here, and Kamalo Inos. Miwa has been such an instrumental part of my sister's life, taking care of her, and it's such a tremendous honor to be in this circle with you, Miwa. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging such an important person in the life of my family. So thank you so much for everything, Miwa. As well as everybody else here on the panel who, I consider collaborators, Tina, James, Kamuela, and Annie. Thank you so much for having me a part of this. We also have a group of students from MIT as part of our architecture studio, Hawaii Nonlinear, with Chris Leong and Dominic Leong. So welcome to all of them. We just finished an assignment called the Nonlinear Self, which is essentially mapping our ancestry. And this image that you see here is a 3D rhino model of the African plate and the Pacific plate. The title of the work is Hawaii Pangea Antipode, and it's produced in ArcGIS and Rhino. In terms of this idea of acknowledgement and acknowledging land, as an architect, I remember before I used to think like every other profession was terrible except the architect. So complain about planners, complain about engineers, all these folks. And I finally, had a moment where, all architects are bad too. And so, in this sort of effort to actually address how complicit all of our professions are in terms of acknowledgement, our students, for example, we just did this exercise to acknowledge our own self and the role that our ancestry plays in our work. What is our relationship to colonialism? How does that relationship affect our future? I think are fundamental questions for the future of our profession. Assuming that a lot of people in this audience are related to architecture in some kind of way. Decolonizing cities is about decolonizing architecture, decolonizing landscape planning. With this image is, when you draw a line from Hawaii to through the center of the planet, it takes you to Africa, to the Kalahari Desert. And so if there's one thing to take from this image, it's to remember that the Pacific Islands are the largest places on Earth. Our continuity to the crust and to the plate and to the center of our planet geologically forms differently than a continent. So we're really special to rethink our relationship to land and this planet. I only have a few minutes, so I just wanted to share a couple more like images in terms of decolonizing, even the concept of Ahupua'a, land division. These are diagrams looking at different ways to think about land, whether it's aquifer or soil, or the moon and the shadows that the moon casts at night, as well as the motion of wind. And before I pass it off to our next panelist, I wanted to share some images from a current project that's up at Thomas Square called 16 Cube Truss About Building Systems, which features a interlocking square framework that represents, to an extent, modern architecture that's held together only by the technology of canoe lashing adapted to this form. And the sculpture here is symbolizes a sort of new old feature for Hawaii, as Monolani Meyer likes to describe the new old feature, utilizing the technology of lashing here. And yeah, with that 5 minutes, I will pass it off to the next panelist. Thank you so much. Looking forward to our conversation.
Mahalo nui. And that's Miwa and myself. So we're going to share screen. And I think Miwa is going to go first and kind of just give the context, and I'll follow up on what she had, what she's going to be working on. So I'm just going to make sure I share my screen. I don't know if everyone can see the full screen or if it's not. Sorry about that. My share screen feature seems to be working really well. But Miwa, you can go in and out. Okay. Yeah, we could just go with the slides as we are.
Work.
Run them hard, baby.
Thanks, Kamwen. Thank you, Sean. Yeah, Sean and I got to converse a little bit yesterday on email, and he sent me a couple of his papers, and I've just been really like, you know, compelled over and over again by Sean's thinking and ability to reimagine and share. It's pretty mind-blowing. I guess I have been thinking a lot with respect to decolonizing the city about like what is a city and what do we mean by urban and rural. The organization that I'm privileged to be a co-founder and co-leader of today is called Kua'aina Ulu Awamo. And Kua'aina is rural people. If you go to the next slide, Kamu, this is the book Na Kua'aina by Auntie Davy, or actually Dr. Professor Daviana McGregor, Auntie Davy, affectionately to many of us. And she writes about how, you know, what Kua'aina means is to be a backbone person of the land. And it's synonymous with the English, like being rural, but I wanted to read a little bit about this. A Kua'aina came to be looked upon as someone who embodied the backbone of the land. Indeed, Kua'aina are the native Hawaiians who remained in the rural communities of our islands, took care of the kupuna, the elders, continued to speak Hawaiian, bent their backs and worked and sweated in the taro patches and sweet potato fields, and held that which is precious and sacred in the culture in their care. And so, you know, I hope we get to talk about this a little bit more in this conversation about in the context of Hawaii and indeed in other spaces, and respect to the indigeneity of the places where we are. What do we mean when we say urban, and what do we mean when we say rural, and what does that say about the relationship that we are striving to have with place. If you went down Kamo a little bit more, I just wanted to share a few pictures of Kua facilitates networks of fishers, farmers, gatherers, and families. So again, these are precious, like that was just precious, like our culture keepers, our Kua āina people. And this is, what that work looks like. It's community organizing work, it's planning work, it's movement work. Kind of taking, we call it, this is from Parker Palmer, The Logic of Movements, but taking what feels like private problems and then coming together and seeing the commonality in what we're trying to accomplish. This last picture is actually a Board of Land and Natural Resources hearing where with the support of a network of communities around Hawaii, the community of Ha'ena, after really almost 20 years of work, was able to get rules, community proposed rules for their subsistence fishery passed for that community. So really talking about, I think, like having a right and a say to malama your place and to be in relationship with place that is reciprocal and caring, and that we can have that no matter where we are. So yeah, with that, I'll pass it on to Kamu.
I'm all the way back up to the top, doing to watch this behind the scenes. So aloha mai, ovo o Kamola Joseph Nui Inos o āina ku o maka ku o nehana o kaala ku mauna o honua ku ka Hawaii o makua ku ka Hakai. So I am currently the director of the brand new Office of Indigenous Innovation for the Office of Research and Innovation for Systems, formerly was a director of social enterprise at Maui Organic Farms, also a lecturer at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. But first and foremost, I'm a Waianae boy. There's somehow at the University of Hawaii, kind of nut stuff. So hopefully I can share some of those there. What I want to, there's plenty to talk about, but the specific context of, I want to share quickly was this idea of decolonizing cities and some of the genealogy of thought that went into it that led to our meeting today. Part of where this thinking came from was this framework that we had been, part of the genealogy was a framework that we had created when I was a lecturer at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning called Urban āina. And Urban āina is, well, āina, for those of you who are not from Hawaii, is one of our powerful, it's like the word freedom in America. āina is for Hawaii, really richly emotional and sometimes poorly defined. And I think the need for us to define it very specifically allows it to not be co-opted and greenwashed. So it's that which feeds, and it's the systems that feed us. It's not inert land, it's the entirety. And I think āina also encompasses people, it encompasses our spiritual dimensions and all of that. So one of the jobs I had in teaching at UH was continuing a class that was started by Auntie Puanani Burgess, and then stewarded by Bob Agres, the then founder of the Hawaii Alliance for the Community-Based Economic Development. And it was a class basically on how to get graduate students in planning department, but other disciplines, to learn how to work in community and to understand that the community that you work for as a planner are the experts of what they know. And your job as a community-centered planner is to help listen and serve and help them take the expertise that they're heirs to and transit it into a system that may be foreign and antithetical to what they're doing, and change the system into something that values their practices. So for many years, the class was basically tied to a group of students and then tied to a practitioner that we would go out and work in the community with to get the students to provide a practitioner a deliverable that would help them in their work. And the things we found fascinating in working here was on Oahu, the urban and rural divide is kind of like a really weird one because we're a small island. And I'm from a rural community of 40,000 people of Native Hawaiians. And you drive 15 minutes and you're in a super non-rural place. So like on an island, I think those terms are complex. But we had been working with a lot of cultural practitioners who were actually working in urban spaces. And it was a fascinating reality, especially on Oahu, if you're familiar with Oahu. Some of the last urban spaces, quote unquote, that aren't suburbs are the homes to a lot of the Hawaiians and a lot of the local people who have long ties here, who are Kama'aina. It's this corridor that goes from Honolulu all the way out through the Everglades that a lot of our work is situated in. And really quickly, we chose one project to work on, which was with this Aloha āina Kanaka. His name is Anthony DeLuz, and his Ohana DeLuz. Ohana DeLuz were stewarding a 2.5 acre license at Kamehameha school lands in the middle of a shopping center in urban Aiea. And in that space, he was doing all of these really fascinating things in an urban space that were traditionally thought of things that were done in rural space. And as my father is a practitioner, I was raised in Lo'ikalo, but my father was also an artist. And one of the books he had lying around was a book on surrealism. And I talked about the work that surrealists did was juxtapose. Just put things, take them out of their familiar context and put them into another context that allows people's heads to break open with aha moments. And realize doing terraforming in the middle of a shopping center is a really fascinating place to be doing a cultural practice because you have this juxtaposition happening. So I tasked the graduate students to come in and to identify what are all the billable services a terraformer that is doing work in the middle of Prairie Shopping Center can provide a heavy urbanized community and find all these discrete things that they're doing and be able to enumerate them and share them back. We did this in partnership with the landowner, which was Kamehameha Schools, and we worked on it together. So the name of the vahi is Ka'anohi Farm. The name of the practitioner is Anthony DeLuz. He ran it with his son, Josiah, and all his babies and his wife. And they were really stalwart kupaina of that place, fighting incredible odds through Okalo in the middle of a hot shopping center. We shared some of the stakeholders because as Miwa shares, ideas are great, but how you do them is everything. So it was really a deep dive in how we listen as planners to what they said they needed. And how do you teach planning students to not walk in there as experts, but to understand that they have a name, like Auntie Ponani says, so they're intrinsically worthy, but they have a responsibility. They have a calling that's theirs. And they have to be clear on what their calling is so they don't walk into spaces barfing help all over people, but taking care of like, I am called to do this work. How do I manage my energy in the space? And the last thing we have them go through is you have a gift. And that gift is how you meet the world through which your name is allows you to be in the world. So we did the work of identifying the stakeholders, who are the people that mattered. And you see Anthony in the middle, and you see his boy Josiah to the left of him. And I'm the dummy sitting underneath Josiah in that Brady Bunch thing that's going on. So this was all the people that we got together to figure out how do we do it. And then we had a graduate student, and this was put together by a graduate student in my class, Nigel Rosette and his peer Cole Hendrickson. So this is how they were able to capture all of this. We call this our āina billables chart. On the right side, we have the blue, all of the assets that is currently in play. The middle is the catalyst with Konohiki farms. But on my, I guess the left is the blue, and on my right is all of the different things that we could start to look at. Hey, this is what a terra farm is providing an urban community that we can begin to think about building supports for. And I guess the place where I'll stop and maybe we can circle back later because I'm at my 5 minutes was it was substantial. And the follow-up wasn't that everyone got it and they worked together and was happy. It wasn't that at all. It spoke to now we need to figure out, we're in the process of transiting this. How do all our systems recognize this and we comprehensively begin to shift as a hui to revalue Indigenous thinking, not just, oh, that's cool or that's something we're guilty to do, but this is absolutely vital as planners for us to find the ways to justify, to scale, and to not have the people who hold the knowledge, the kama'aina, lost in the process, to center it on them. They're the most important people because they are the knowledge holders. We have to support them in the work. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to the next person. And I'd love to pick it up later in the dialogue part after. Really.
I think that might be the next person. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I'm calling from the lands of the Tonga people, Los Angeles County, but I spent 9 years doing my graduate studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and really was trying to understand sort of slowly, what does it mean to be within a settler colonial framework? And sort of what does it mean to be able to deconstruct, right, those logics and then resurface, sort of embrace, Native Hawaiian understandings of land, right? What does Aloha āina actually mean in practice? And I'm going to add just a quote in the chat, which is a 1982 Hawaii State Supreme Court case that was looking at sort of the right to gather, traditional materials from, lands, regardless of ownership. And the ruling was that, to allow for native gathering rights on developed land would, quote, so conflict with understandings of property and potentially lead to such disruption that we could not consider it anything short of absurd. And hopefully you see on the share screen, this is an image of a 1970 Kalama Valley struggle, I guess, newspaper that was really kind of pointing out how ridiculous it was. And, Bishop Estate is now Kamehameha Schools, but it's a Native Hawaiian land trust. And the fact that a, trustee was saying that in the modern world, the Hawaiian lifestyle should be illegal. And I think, people may not be saying this in such stark kind of derogatory terms these days, but there's really, I think, a sense that, well, like cities are cities, right? Like those are already lost to settler colonial logics, that we kind of have to just accept that and then do our best to protect and nurture, in rural lands in the back of the valley. And yet I think that's sort of where Kamu's urban Aloha āina, like thinking about, what does it actually look like to decolonize suburbs, for example, right? Decolonize Waipio gentry, beginning to, I think, as Tuti was saying, like really like make the place, right, the center. I think these are the things that I'm still just kind of grappling with. But let's see. I did want to kind of caution us that, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang have written, decolonization is not a metaphor, nor is decolonization design or a aesthetic. So Kaka'ako, for folks who do not know, it is a neighborhood in urban Honolulu between downtown and Waikiki. And it has been since the 1970s, this hot potato, a huge contention over what really should be the form of urban Honolulu. And KS, Kamehameha Schools, and Howard Hughes Corporation are the two major private landowners. So this particular image is showing one of the luxury condos that were built on the Howard Hughes Ward Village side. And sort of this celebration from architects. All architects are bad, according to Sean, but that this idea that, oh, well, it will make wind visible. We're respecting Mauka, Makai, like, connections. I mean, all of this sort of celebration of, I think, Hawaiianness, Hawaiian language, and Hawaiian ideas, but within the context of racialized capitalism, real estate capitalism, and a sort of a lack of attention to the relationality of land, right? That you can buy this aesthetic, this idea, never mind what is actually āina. So I'll just end with this image, which is, I still scream every time I look at this. So this was in the Honolulu Star Advertiser a few years back, but this is actually their annual award. So the Honolulu Realtors Association has their annual awards given to the best, real estate professionals in this state, and they call it Aloha āina. And so I think just the need to, I think, continually challenge, right? So I'm excited that this conversation is actually way more about the practices by which folks indigenize and resurface and and resurgence. But I'm here to kind of be the grumpy person to say, well, let's be clear on sort of what are the legal and psychological structures that need to be dismantled in order to allow these much more grounded and much needed, I guess, ways of being in loving relationship with the land. And I'll stop there.
Awesome. I think I'm next. Aloha, I'm Tina Grandinetti. I'm a Uchinanchu settler from Mililani, and I'm finishing up my dissertation, my doctoral studies from RMIT University on the lands of the Kulin Nation in Australia, but I'm back home in Hawaii now, zooming from Kapalulu, so we're neighbors, Sean. When I think about decolonizing the city, I think about property, because property it defines basically every way that we interact with the urban, and the kinds of property that are normally deployed by settler capitalism actively seek to apprehend indigenous relationships to land in order to extract profit from that land. But I want us to kind of think more broadly about how when we claim property, what we're doing is constructing a relationship of belonging. So most of the time, settler property regimes define that relationship by ownership and possession and exclusion. Like, I own this piece of land and you can't use it. But that relationship can look different if we want it to. And so I guess the intervention I want to make is that decolonizing the urban means that we have to start untangling property from exclusion and the violence that comes with it, and start thinking about it from a decolonial perspective, or at least asking if that's possible. And one way I think we can do this is by looking to the spaces that Kanaka and poor and working class settlers have created to provide refuge from the violence of settler colonial capitalism, and specifically from our super oppressive and predatory housing regime, whether that's houseless encampments or even the multi-generational homes that allow us to care for each other despite the pressures of capitalism. So rather than just seeing these as spaces of precarity, I want us to think about them as political spaces that have something to share with us about how to build more just urban futures, because like Haunani K. Trask argued, the modern Hawaiian movement was ignited in many ways by the Kalama Valley housing struggle, which Annie talked about. And we've seen this long history of pu'uhonua that were formed out of different forms of housing dispossession and evolved into political struggle, like what we saw in Waimanalo or in Makua, where they actually challenged the US military bombing of āina. So centering these spaces helps us to see complex, a lot of times contradictory, and sometimes liberatory ways that Kanaka Maoli are challenging and subverting property. And one example is at Pu'uhonua o Waianae, which is a houseless encampment where Kanaka were able to stop the state from evicting them from public land, because they had built these super dense relationships of belonging to āina and to each other and to the surrounding Waianae community by inviting people into kuleana, or reciprocal responsibilities. And it started out as simple stuff like asking residents to commit to 8 hours of community service, but then it grew into planting a mala, taking care of opaiula habitat, even bringing food and reaching out to other encampments around the island, so that when the state finally announced its plans to evict, it found that there were so many people in the broader community that felt a kuleana to protect Pu'uhonua o Waianae. And they couldn't do it without sparking like massive public criticism. And so to me, this is an instance where Kanaka relationships of belonging formed what Sarah Keenan calls subversive property. And they were able to create this subversive property by reasserting relationships, indigenous relationships of kuleana to āina and to community in ways that disrupted a very powerful legal property regime, at least for a little while. And what I love about this is that their claim to land rested on something other than like these normative commitments to property and ownership. And they essentially converted what's traditionally a rights-based claim into a responsibility-based claim or a kuleana-based claim. And I'm focusing on kuleana here, not because it's the only way to describe what happens at Pu'uhonua Waianae, but because it's a term that's already so tied up with property and belonging, right? Like it means it means the responsibilities and privileges that grow out of our relationship to āina. But since the mahele, it also became incorporated into the private property system, so that it kind of means like title or estate. And I think that these shifting definitions, on the one hand, they tell a story about how āina was transformed by the settler state into from an ancestor to a commodity. But on the other hand, they also speak to the ways that Hawaiian relationships to land continue to structure thinking about the foundations of property claims. So I guess the questions that I want to leave us with are, what if we took kuleana seriously as a theoretical underpinning for Kamakaʻoʻiwi property practices in urban space? I think that would force us to rethink the social and ecological impacts of trying to build our way out of a housing crisis on an island with limited land and in the middle of a global climate catastrophe. And I think it would help us to see the ways that capitalist formations of home and housing and home ownership actually act as a means of disciplining our relationships to land. Because our current property regime is so hurtful to the vast majority of people here. And we have to start finding ways to live the kinds of relationships of belonging that can sustain us. And I think that we're going to find a lot of that work is already being done in these precarious spaces. Thanks.
I guess I'm next. Aloha, I'm James Miller, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm really glad that this happened. When we talked, Annie and I talked about it first, I think in like November or October. So I guess I'll introduce something that I think goes off kind of maybe nicely off of what Tina brought to us, and I'll share a screen. So I'm coming from Bellingham, as well as same as Tuti on the land, so acknowledge the Lummi and Nooksack tribes and Coast Salish peoples who have protected and maintained these lands in time immemorial. Before arriving in Bellingham, I came from Toronto, Oregon. I was born and raised in South Bend, Indiana, which is in the Great Lakes region, just east of Chicago. And my mother's family is from Hungary, and my father's family is from Hawaii, Japan, as well as some Portuguese and Scottish. And I think what brought me, or what brings me to thinking in the conversation of decolonizing the city, is how we're called to our ancestral knowledges, thinking of this idea of DNA memories in our linkages to ancestral knowledge and place. And again, this idea of centering. So growing up in the Pacific diaspora, I think kind of highlights that kind of call for myself, as well as where I'm located with my research currently, which is with the Marshallese communities and diasporas in the continental United States, as well as in Hawaii. And that's kind of slowly linked me. That's slowly kind of brought me to thinking more about engaging and understanding the more Hawaiian ways of thinking and being, and also seeing relationships. So I'm a professor of contemporary Indigenous studies, hence why I often think of these connections and try to draw relationships. Also having worked with many colleagues on Southern Ontario, as well as in British Columbia, and thinking about the linkages there as well, and how we might provide paths forward. And I think this idea of responsibility and reciprocity are really central to this way of kind of recentering a more healthy, sustainable relationship with environment that connects this idea of thinking in 7 or 10 generations. So right in the Hawaiian sense of, or Moana sense, not just Hawaiian, Moana sense of space-time, you're always thinking of 5 generations behind and 5 generations in the future. It's where you're always in this location that brings the future and the past with you in the present as a way to think about how you walk forward. So I'm just going to introduce a perspective from architecture and design. So I'm an architect. I also agree with Sean that architects are problematic. And I really like how Kamu kind of introduced the idea that planners, you're not, you kind of take away the ego, and architects are full of ego. So they could learn from this as well, that you have to introduce yourself into a space as a facilitator that brings, you bring your energy and your gifts with you in this mode of collaborative thinking or collective action, rather than your own agenda or the state's agenda or your firm's agenda, whoever's agenda it is. And that's where I think we need to be more prepared to think within a system of ethics, which I'll introduce. So just wanted to, so the first slide was the lava flows from the 2018 Kilauea eruption. That was in Puna, Big Island, Hawaii. And which was also kind of a calling to think about how architecture and planning connects to place and centers these ideas and notions of place. And thinking about how we build relationships with these, again, this is like connecting design approaches within this kind of shifting centers from a continental perspective to a Moana Hawaiian perspective. In thinking more deeply about the genealogy of a place, or the mo'okahau, and how we learn from those histories and those stories, and how we should be in relationship with a place. And it becomes kind of a much more social and collective process, as opposed to how we typically think of design. So this is just looking at 2 kind of design thinking cycles, borrowed from, well, the one on the left is just a general approach you can see in most design books. And the one on the right is borrowing from the WCIT, as well as Details. This was developed, blanking on the name that they call themselves, the Kuhi Kui Pu'one collaboration, which is Robbie Opa, it's WCIT Detail Studio, which is Malia Kaihue, and the Edith Kanahele Foundation, which is this rethinking of design, which we could probably bring a discussion up with that in Kakako, since they're one of the designers in that project. But I just want to end here and thinking about how is ethics, how might we redefine ethics based on these ideas of responsibility, reciprocity. And I think also just the idea of reciprocity is that it's a symmetrical relationship of reciprocity, where it's not creating some asymmetrical power dynamic between different entities, which tends to happen in practice and in research. And thinking about how, how does our love of land, love of place, change our relationship, change how we approach that space, how we connect in a responsible and reciprocal manner with the community we're working in, bringing in some Marshallese concepts of togetherness, ipandron, which also enacts responsibility and that same reciprocity. And there's great Marshallese phrase, which is, well, Anrabwe Genlalirara, which loosely, translates to that relationship to the bread and butter of Marshallese culture, this idea that collective action is central to how we operate in a responsible and respectful manner with the land including the ocean. And I think similarly, thinking of what Tina introduced, thinking of how do we consider housing from, again, non-Western perspective, and address these exclusionary forces that exist. So this idea of Mlap Woj, which is loosely the multi-generational living situation, but it's not just this spatial differentiation and how we plan and design houses, but it's also thinking about the house as a continuation of knowledge and an actual center that is for the dissemination of knowledge between generations and among family and community. And then similarly, Kumit, this idea of how we work together in a collective action and how we grow together and prosper, which tying back to Hula āina and Tuti's introduction. With that, I'm going to stop share. And I don't know if anyone wants to reflect on any of the introductions so far, or otherwise I can provide some prompts.
I just think we have such a wonderful group of folks, and I appreciated the time and space to have it set up. And I think, yeah, I welcome the conversation because I think there's commonality that's clear, but I love the diversity of opinions and approaches that I heard in all of the other speakers. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I guess if I can put something out there, I was really struck by what Tina said about what if we took kuleana seriously, and thinking about not what if we just without any qualifiers, what if we just took kuleana seriously, everywhere, all the time, and what would that look like? And just thinking through all of these different examples and stories that we heard, this intersection between stewardship, responsibility, kuleana, obviously we're trying to use English words to contain non-English concepts. But so this stewardship, responsibility, relationship, but then I also feel like there was this silent thing about then how does that then become governance, right? And how are we governing land use and our spaces? And I was thinking about one of the things that we've worked on, that picture that I showed of everybody celebrating, was this community-based subsistence fishing area. And despite the fact that fisheries are commons, right? They're managed by the state as a commons. Everybody can go and everybody can take. We have seen declines year over year that are widely acknowledged across the islands, that there is not as much anymore as used to get. That's scientifically, and as well as we know from our practitioners and what they say, they see, right? From elders saying yeah, I used to have more, now it's less. So it's what governance says about housing and our supply of housing that's managed in a certain way, and then our supply of food, and fish, which is managed in a different way, but both are not providing what we all need together. And so I don't know, just throwing that out is curious to hear.
I think, oh, sorry, Kamu, were you gonna go?
No.
I was just thinking similarly along the lines Miwa just brought up on how do Indigenous ways of thinking, Hawaiian ways of being, like kuleana and reciprocity, provide these modes for creating inclusive cities or inclusive urbanism. Thinking, one thing I've been thinking a lot more and more is how the idea of ā-moana, how space is relational, and as Tuti introduced with the introduction of Derrida into the Maori Marae, and how we think of protocol. And I don't know if we, yeah, like thinking of governance, how do you codify protocol, which I know there's examples of that happening. I think Emily Porter's written about it in Aotearoa as far as the urban marae, but thinking of how we change relationships, both in the human and non-human realms that allow for these inclusive spaces to be created.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think part of, you know, my learning and my discipline and like the genealogy of the work I do now has a genealogy of two tiers. One of them is the work of the kupuna, and I would think when we were doing the urban and framework, we started to realize that, you know, so much of this idea of indigenization to me is to take the systems that are thrust upon you and then find ways to repurpose them to be vehicles for your ancestors' responsibilities. And it's not a negation of decolonization, it was like the what's next, right? And I think part of the decolonization, it still centers on the colonial structures. And I think the indigenizing is recentering it on how we establish the mastery of our kupuna in a contemporary space. And it's like, what does that look like? It's like, well, that's what we've been doing for, and ukulele is an example of a decolonized Spanish guitar, or like kiho'alu. Nothing about it, when you look at a kiho'alu player, it looks Hawaiian, but when you hear it, you snap it on a video where someone's planting kalo and voila, you have something Kanaka, right? It's this process of taking these things and moving them forward. So like, it's a part of a prerogative of indigenous people to understand that their ancestral systems have to be brought into a contemporary space. The second thing I think a lot about is, you know, then we have to understand, I think of innovation through two tiers. You know, like the first tier is like an indigenous innovation, is the innovations are kupuna created. And how do we look at them in their own space? Like what is our role in making sure that they are researched for their validity and protected? And the second tier is how their mo'opuna, the progeny of these kupuna, are deploying them in a contemporary way. And you think of hula kahiko and hula awana, like you have the things you protect and preserve, because that's the basis from where things iterate out. But then the awana is the things that you take and then you make ballroom dancing happen through the lens of hula. And then you have these beautiful iterative ideas that are almost fractal in nature, like they hold the seed of the thought, but they represent the spaces of continuity. So that's the first thing I think a lot about. And the second is like the kind of activism I was raised in was my dad's generation, where they were doing activism in an urban community, a rural community, right? That was poor. And they couldn't just be like, well, we're gonna say no and we're gonna publish papers. Like, we gotta create jobs. If we don't create jobs, you're gonna be seen as these Hawaiians that went to college and they're just talking to people about things that people are trying to eat. So they did so much work of like, well, how do we do that? And I watched them, for example, bring Uncle Eddie Ka'ana, Ona, and Uncle Walter Paulo, Tua, and I to restart oil fishing. At the same time, they did backyard aquacultures to kind of have this, learn about what was their ancestral systems intact in a living space, and then how do you create these contemporary correlates. And I think what they honed in on is creating jobs. And that was the big thing. It's like, if you're not creating jobs, then you're actually starting to be subject. You do the cultural practice at night and during the day, you're still stuck in doing the jobs that are hurting the landscape around you, but that's the reality. And I think that by the idea of like getting into the economic development piece, you're actually interceding in the point of the most dangerous part of this contemporary structure, and how these things are, how value is assigned and what constitutes highest and best use. And those jobs then are kind of gauged by performance metrics. It's like, is your business profitable? Are you creating these things? And then all along the scale of learning, they start to like, well, let's inhabit this space and define a conversation. And I think that created the ma'os and the purple ma'os that then cultivated the dual fluency of like, oh, we can be a cultural practice, but we also can really perform well in a contemporary space. But we're also in the contemporary space not seeing that, oh, we're successful by contemporary standards, so therefore we're successful. It's like we're successful vehicles of our ancestral practices. So we're gonna care for our soil, and we're gonna care for our young learners, and we're gonna grow food again, like the kupuna in this valley did. We're going to have these metrics of sales of product and GPAs of students so that the world around us understands our value, but we're going to check ourselves to make sure that our places of practice are still maintained. And that's a super long kind of salvo, I think, of thought. But I do think if we talk of governance, the thing I've real like being raised in Waianae, like we see power pretty explicitly. If you can't knock somebody out, you're not powerful. If you can talk about knocking people out, but you can't do it, well, good luck with that. So it kind of gives me a raw understanding of power, and the business of government is business. And if that's the nature of what we're up against, how do we be in those places and transform it in excellence in their language, but also provide it in a way that we understand and value relative to them, so that we can be at the different tables? Kind of is something I thought a lot about, how you get governance to want to support you behind a closed door versus supporting you in public and not inviting you behind the closed door conversation because you're not actually doing something that allows them to be powerful, which is providing a tax income or some kind of things they need to do. Sorry, that's super plain. I'll shut up for the rest of the time.
You always say that. I love it.
I'll be accountable to it, Sean. Please tell me to shut up.
Please don't shut up.
Well, I mean, if I might just jump in there to just add a sort of critical I don't know what you call it, but just bringing us back to the slide that Annie shared of the Board of Realtors Aloha āina award, and actually thinking about how many Kanaka Maoli, how many Native Hawaiians are on the competing for that award, and in what ways are they trying to get that award? We're trying to shift, as Tui Smith talks about, right? Shifting the center so that we want to pressure the Board of Realtors to really look at kuleana as the metrics for making that award, rather than who's making the most money. I mean, I think that jobs are important, but being able to do a job with kuleana, with responsibility to ancestors and to the future is really important value that needs to be emphasized every time we speak about that.
Yeah.
Could I jump in a little bit? Because I really like the thread that's happening in terms of kuleana, jobs, food, and then I'm always wondering, like, where does our built environment fit into this? Where does architecture, landscape architecture planning play a role? In terms of kuleana, I love the term kuleana. It has been core to my practice. And then also just the influence of our community in terms of expanding those definitions of kuleana. So, there's kuleana in terms of the idea of responsibility. There's also kuleana in terms of, it's a land term, a small area of land. So that's kind of cool that there's this like connection between, the idea of responsibility and then land. And then also, to sort of speak to the experts here, Kamuela and Miwa, about Awamo kuleana and this idea of collective transformation through individual excellence. I have to definitely give a shout out to the Enos family, because Kamuela, your brother, is such a foundational artist that I look up to as an artist myself. And so, yeah, kuleana is definitely a key term in terms of our responsibility and this idea of excellence and the transformation of our community. And what does it change if it's not a job, it's your responsibility? And one thing, so to add to all of that conversation in terms of where we're at in terms of the resurgence compared to maybe where we can go next. It's amazing to see myself as Keikioka āina, growing up from the 90s until now, just how much progress has been made. You know, when I was in elementary school, there wasn't like, you know, there wasn't really lo'i to go to. There wasn't like fish pond to go help like restore the makaha for, and whatnot. You know, and so like, you know, you had to seek out those kinds of experiences. And now I feel like it's pretty foundational for most public school and private school students to have those kinds of experiences, to see, you know, just on Oahu alone, like Papahana Kuola, Paepae Ho'ia, looking at the Big Island, that with like Hui Mao and Noel Peralta and Haley Kalehu folks. It's just really amazing to see just how important food has been in helping to reconnect us to that sense of kuleana. In terms of architecture, what I'm interested in is the material systems that are the foundation of those food systems. So for example, the olona that you need to make cordage for a net to catch fish. What are the sort of responsibilities around getting that, like in terms of jobs and economy, right? Like if we actually look at the food system and then go down to the next level, what are the material systems that are necessary for this food system to survive? You know, that's kind of what our students for our class at MIT are looking at next, in terms of analyzing different material systems, you know, olana, lolu palm for thatching, ulu for glue. There's a whole like future of work that we can tap into if we focus on the material of our built environment. And I think we're on the right track because food is our entry point to that. So anyway, that's what I thought. That's what I was running through my mind as you folks were talking about the sort of like chain of events, right? So that's what I have to offer. And now I'll shut up.
I just saw the question in the Q&A. There's a University of Hawaii graduate of the Urban and Regional Planning Department who is now back in California. And just thinking about, you know, how do these approaches exist in sort of the city and county planning entities? I would say that doesn't even have to just be the planning entities, right? How do these exist? I mean, going back to the question of like governance and like, all right, like how do you know, operationalize, you know, decolonial or indigenous, you know, relationships to land? I would say, just from a practical standpoint, you know, being really influenced by the abolitionist movement and thinking about, you know, wherever you're living right now, go look up your city's budget and go look up the percentage of that city's budget that goes to the police department, right? And so kind of from that practical standpoint of where do decolonizing and where we begin, you know, sort of reshaping, you know, what is a system of control into a system of care. I think, you know, one sort of, it's not a low hanging fruit in the sense that it's easy, but it is like a very obvious place to start, you know, at the kind of local level, which is the police. And I think that goes to what I'm interested in and really pushing, you know, both as a teacher, but also just as a person in the world is, you know, how do we kind of cultivate these possibilities and, you know, the sense of possibility, you know, how do we sort of deconstruct the settler capitalist colonial, you know, narratives that we get kind of stuck in, right? Like we're, you know, oh, of course we have private property. Of course, you know, housing is an investment and, you know, never mind housing is a human right. All these things that sort of become normalized over the, you know, decades. How do we then unnormalize them? And I think, you know, that's the thing that is sort of in tandem with that sort of practical aspect of like, okay, if we were going to decolonize a city budget right now, what would that look like, right? If we were going to decolonize Department of Environmental Services, aka sewage, right? You know, from an environmental design standpoint, right? From a civil engineering standpoint, what would that look like? And I think there's very clear possibilities, right? I mean, thinking about gray water, I mean, just there's all these sort of mini things that could be, you know, nerded out on. But I honestly think that you could just go through city departments or county departments and ask that question, right? What are we spending our money on? And how does that either further settler colonial capitalist logics, or how does that then, or how can we then dismantle those logics? I mean, we're not, you know, inside outside, right? There's people working from the outside building a completely different set of possibilities, but then, you know, from the everyday as a planner, right? Going into the system itself and then being like, all right, what can we do right now? What can we do right at this moment to decolonize?
I really like that idea. And I like the question about governance because I just started working at the Capitol. And I just like, it's after working on a dissertation where you just get to think about all these ideas, and then you're in a policy space where you're like, oh, but what about Kuleana? like finding that bridge just seems impossible. But then I think that, like, I'm always reminded of, like, I think I heard this from Andre Perez, but like that Ku'e and Kukulu relationship of like building alternatives, like the spaces we see at Pu'uhono, āina, for example, and then like also standing up to and breaking down the systems of power that are stopping those from scaling up, or like stopping those kipuka from like spreading their seeds in other places. And I think that like we need to be better at that, because in our current system of governance, we have these like Kuleana just isn't part of the discussion at all. Like, for example, every time we talk about public housing affordable housing in Hawaii, or solving the housing crisis in Hawaii, there's always somebody talking about taking public lands out of the public trust. And that's taking Hawaiian lands, and that's kind of like exempting lands from their, or exempting the state from its duty to serve the public good with those lands. And that doesn't make any sense. Like, how does giving people shelter and home require us to remove ourselves from a duty to each other? And then like, even when we think about when we think about the houseless, every year they do a point in time count, and they do a big survey of everyone like living without shelter at that moment. And they ask questions about like whether you suffer from mental illness or substance abuse, but they don't ask why you got evicted, or how you got evicted, or who evicted you. And I think that like those are just two examples of how in our current governance system, like we're serving the real estate industry, we're serving developers, you can like apply this to many different areas of like what the urban means, but we're serving the people who are profiting, not the people who are actually like who have a relationship to this place. So I don't know, that's not an answer, but I really appreciate Miwa's question and Annie's way of kind of thinking through it.
I just wanted to really quickly raise my hand. One of the things I wanted to share, which is super important, is I think the idea of indigenizing, and we talk about it that way, it has an opportunity for us to de-partisanize this work. And I think rooting it, as you're saying, Tina, in community-derived models is super important. So when I worked at Mao, for example, remember there was a week where we had somebody who was full-on Bernie-crat, and then we had a Tea Party Republican come to the farm and cheerlead us. And it was fascinating, right? It was like the Bernie-crat, it was like the Republicans, like you're pulling yourself up from the bootstraps, you're not letting the state tell you what to do, you're taking this on your own terms. And then the Bernie-crat was like, you're sticking it to the man, and like they're like, I think the reality of it is that when you're pulling from your ancestral place, there are things that would be considered both, you know, left and right wing. It was, everyone got cared for. It was a cashless society, and also you broke a rule, we killed you. So it was kind of like you had these really strict systems that, as contemporary Kanaka, we have to, and Kama'aina, understand that the language of the now has its own barriers and it has its limitations. I remember that we had our CSA and we're selling our CSA, and I started seeing people that were buying our CSA that 10 years ago I was scrapping in Hawaiian studies with. It was like, we found an entry point into their language and that we can set up this new framework with them. So I think it being looking at community, the products that are coming from the community versus the academy, and that's something I've always learned, which is really important around the class, is like, how do we root the community who are doing the actual work in addressing, not the grievance part of it, but the practical solution. The grievance is embedded. But what's the practical solution that's working, and what is our role to scale it from there versus having it emanate from the, that was why I like planners, because we didn't start shit. We just took stuff that was already started and tried to figure out how we make it work and scale. And I just, the last thing I say, I always try to run it through this test. So can I tell it to my boys back in Bud Light? Can I tell it to a policymaker? Can I tell it to in a classroom? And then is a person, is it being authentically told that the person who's doing the work doesn't feel like I'm studing them on now and trying to get out of it. And if I could find resonance there, it's exactly like I worked at the Ledge for a little while too, Tina, and laws and sausages, man. If you don't come in there with the solution, you don't go to them with your problems, you go to them with your solutions. And you're really specific in how your solution solves their problems. So you can be really prescriptive on what you need from them. Because if you just go to them with your problems, take a number, and they're going to try to solve the problem with whatever random thing that they're trying to copycat from some other thing they went to make it fit in your community. And at 90% of the chance won't fit. But if you come to them with the solution and that you can think about deriving the methodology from the practice on the ground, it really lifts up why Miwa was so brilliant, why the work at Kua has been so brilliant, and I think why we have such a space for those that have the privilege, first world Kanaka privilege, to be working in a university, to make sure that we're earning our right to be here by lifting up the excellence and expertise of those that hold these ancestral systems in place. So mahalo miki aloha. I'll shut up again.
I just wanted to jump on real quick. Well, first of all, I would love it if Miwa and Kamwala ran for governor, and you can alternate so that you can have like 16 years. Yeah, some words that that were just coming to mind. Na'au, when you said na'au, community and academy. One question I have for the panelists is maybe if anyone has any thoughts on the role of maybe education in shaping na'au, because to a certain extent, when we talk about like this kind of work and this sort of kuleana, there's definitely an aspect of kuleana that you have to learn, but then once you learn, there's an aspect of sort of being self-directed. And I think back to 2016 when I had the chance to go to Standing Rock. I was there for a week, and it was really, I realized the first time I really experienced sort of, they called it camp culture, but it was essentially like the first time I really felt maybe in sort of like a village kind of setting where there was, a good example would be like you basically find your own place. So, it took me like maybe a few days to find that my favorite place was actually being like, I planted myself as a dishwasher in the kitchen that of all the kitchens that were there were like about 8 of them. There was one that was actually run by a tribe that was from that area. And so I joined that kitchen as a dishwasher, and eventually I worked my way up to like learning how to make flatbread and helping to stir like a 4-foot cauldron to feed like a whole bunch of people, and sort of witnessing there's this moment where a person from outside of the group came in with like all her like a scrub like a sanitation stuff, and basically she came in and she like just volunteered and cleaned everything. And her role that she decided was that she's just going to go to kitchen and sanitize. And that was her sort of self-directed responsibility. And I just thought that was like, I was like, wow, like what about this person's experience, like gave that, like let them know that this would be a useful thing to go around sanitize, which back then maybe we take for granted, but now like, oh my God, just how important sanitizing is in the community setting. So yeah, what is the role that education plays in shaping the ao?
Sean, you just made me think of like two instances. One was, I apologize, I forget the name of the elder. This was then Toronto, Ontario at OCAD University. But she mentioned like when you know, similarly when you enter this space that's, you know, controlled by a protocol and you come and create kind of your own, or not, well, yeah, you kind of come in with your own interests, and then you take a responsibility that you decide is your responsibility. And her point was that if you're it's like your responsibility to reconnect with your ancestral knowledge. It's not a kapuna's responsibility to kind of guide you, which is a very different take on education. And similarly, I remember I was trying to track down Francis Sinechi a few years ago to do an interview. And he said, like, they were doing the hale build at West Oahu. And I think he just told me, like, show up at 8 a.m. And that was all he said. And I had no other, like, directions. So I didn't go. And then I, like, finally met up with Uncle Scotty at āina, was one of Francis's students. And he's like, oh, yeah, man, you got to just show up. But it's similar, right? Like, you take on that responsibility and you take on your own direction. And that's part of the learning and engagement.
You know, I think we had started at Ho'ulu āina with Tuti, and I just wanted to call attention to, in the background, there's that classic sign that's actually, I know we've talked about Solomon, but Kamu's brother painted that sign. It says, "This land is your grandmother and she loves you." So I just wanted to share, like, my understanding of that story, or the story behind that sign, is that that sign at one time was, when we talk about policing and governance and education and all those things, that sign said, "No dumping." This much fines, go to jail. I can't remember exactly the wording of the sign. And people continued to dump, right? It's like up at the back of Kalihi Valley, which, you know, many folks on this panel have connections to Kalihi as well. So one day Solomon went out and painted over the sign, and he painted that, said, "This land is your grandmother and she loves you. She loves you." And the dumping went down, right? Like, the behavior changed. And so, yeah, I just wanted to, I felt like we started at Ho'ulu āina, and, you know, thank you, Tuti, for bringing that circle. They're such amazing heroes, and especially during COVID, have just been tremendous, like, heroes and hustlers, Puni and all her crew back at Ho'ulu āina. So, yeah.
You know, I have to say that living now so far away from home without having an easy way to get home. I mean, I don't feel I can. It would be not totally anti-Kuleana to fly home right now. And so I feel I'm really glad to bring them into my space. And in some ways, this is a response to a question in the Q&A, which I'll read right now. A question for those who are not currently living on your ancestral land. How are you engaging in Aloha āina and respecting the local place? Do you have advice for those who want to respectfully care for and learn from the land they occupy without appropriating or taking away from those who come from the that land. Mahalo for this panel and your knowledge. And, I think it is really sitting in place and really thinking about what your relationship to that place is and how you're going to respect the ancestors of the land and the people who are carrying on the ancestral relationships. Obviously, it's not just barging in and saying, "Here I am. I'm going to participate." You have to be welcomed. And if we go back to that first picture of the pofiri, you stand outside the gate and you sing your song and you wait until the host sings you in.
I want to also share real fast that slide I showed of the āina billables is like this idea of how to enter is like you have a name, so you're intrinsically a human being, so you're ready. But then if you feel called to enter, you have to stay with that. Why? Like, why are you called to enter? If you're a non-Kanaka and listening to this right now, why does this resonate to you? And I think because everyone's indigenous to someplace, and that's what we lost in this trade-off of industrialization. We gain cool things. I can be with you. The thing is, I don't want to be like, and everything is horrible because I could be remotely talking to you, but we've gained stuff. And if we're not acknowledging that, we're lying. But I think it's the recalibration. So it's that's where you have to sit with like, well, why am I called to this? And really do the work and understand what allyship and everything means. And then the final thing is you have a gift though. And that gift allows you entry so that on the right, all the aggregate, different things that we saw coming from the Lo'i was actually not an exhaustive list. In fact, it was a list of the gifts the students were studying at the moment saw when they studied the Lo'i. And they able to say, hey, Anthony, if you talk about the heat displacement that's happening because of your terraform, you can actually start to charge people for this. So it was, the gift wasn't like, oh, or like your entry isn't like, oh, I feel guilty, so I'm here. I think I'm healthy. Is not. You can put measurables, and metrics matter. Our kupuna have metrics. We have metrics now. And the metrics which allow you to be there in service allow you to have that great feedback loop. Like, I'm more than helping. I'm peers. Like, I understand sexuality. I understand who carries the risk, who can go home and who can't. But if I'm here, I know I'm helping and I've listened. So I think that is something, if you take anything from this, that there's processes to enter.
I just wanted to mention that I included a list of recommended films. So this is not just for folks who are currently enrolled in a school, but really we're all students. And I think, cultivating that sense of possibility and seeing how other folks, across the globe are claiming, reclaiming, renewing relationship with the land and with one another is something that I highly recommend. So please check that out.
I know we could go on for many more hours, but we're coming to our 90-minute mark. If we want to have a closing, perhaps close this space before saying our farewells, but we can certainly continue this discussion in a future roundtable. So I don't know if Tuti, did you want to conclude?
I guess I thought this was never going to end. I didn't think about how we're going to conclude. I think we just think about how we're going to continue, even as we close the circle. I think about Ho'olu āina, and what the way we end a work day is we all gather again in a circle. So again, we collectively gather in a circle in this Zoom land, and I'll articulate what we're thankful for, and to reflect on what we learn and how we're going to take the insights from the panel today forward into our relationships to place as we move about even as we're in a pandemic and we can't move about so freely as we would like to. I guess good health to everyone, and thank you very much.
I'll offer too, Tuti. I can do closing only mahalo. And I think maybe that can, I do feel we open the space in ritual, so we should close the space in ritual too. Even though mahalo is and Ihoma is contemporary only. I'll close it. And so Ole is a chat of thanks. And I was wondering, because we can also save the chat, if everyone who's in the space can actually just put something that they got from this as a form of a question, so that we can save things that came up, just to acknowledge that we're closing the space too. Well, I give thanks to all of the listeners and to the speakers, and more importantly to the land and the kupuna that hold us. So I'll just close it only mahalo. If people feel inclined, they can drop in the chat something that they feel thankful for. Uhola ia ka makalohala, huai ke alohala, kuka ia ka halohala, pavehi mai nā lehua, mai koho oku ia ka halawaila, mahalo e nā akua, mahalo e nā kupuna la ea. Mahalo me ke alohala. Mahalo me ke alohala. Exhale. Exhale. Aloha a mama wana. Alane. Should make call Hana after this, you guys. That's kako.